My name is Richard Hayes. I am 65 years old, and I believed Christmas night would be a quiet evening of family filled with memories of my late wife Margaret and the warmth she left behind. But as snow covered the streets outside our old Ohio home, I sat at the long table waiting for her will to be read, hoping for peace. Instead, my daughter stood before everyone and stripped me of fatherhood with words so sharp they cut deeper than the winter wind. The room froze, whispers spread, and I realized this night would open wounds I never thought possible. What could drive a child to erase her own father? And what secret was hidden in Margaret's will that no one else had seen? Stay with me, because once you hear what came after that moment, you will understand why this Christmas changed everything. The night of Christmas 2023 should have been warm, filled with laughter and the kind of comfort that only family gatherings bring. But for me, it felt like walking into a storm I could not see coming. The snow was falling heavy outside our old family home in Columbus, Ohio, the kind that softens the streets and makes the world feel quiet. Inside, though, the voices of cousins and neighbors echoed off the high ceilings. The tree stood in the corner, glowing with gold lights, and Margaret's old ornaments still hung on the branches. She had been gone for 5 years now, but her presence lingered in every detail of that house. I sat at the long table, surrounded by relatives, some leaning close to whisper about who would get what, others filling their plates as if it were any other holiday. For me, it was different. Tonight, the will of my late wife Margaret was being read in front of everyone. I had carried the weight of her absence for years, and I thought that hearing her wishes would finally bring closure. Samuel Clark, our family lawyer, cleared his throat and unfolded the papers. He was steady as always, his voice calm in a way that usually eased me. He began to read Margaret's words about her love for her children, her desire for peace between us all. I felt my throat tighten when I heard her handwriting brought to life. My daughter Olivia sat across the table. She had on a crimson dress, her hair pulled back tight, her eyes sharp the way only a lawyer's eyes could be. At 34, she carried herself with authority that drew attention. Her husband Mark sat beside her, smug, his hand resting casually on her arm, as if reminding everyone that they were in control. At first, everything seemed ordinary. Samuel spoke about the house, the land outside Columbus, the accounts Margaret had kept careful track of. I thought it would end simply with everyone acknowledging what was fair. I had no reason to think otherwise. Then Olivia pushed back her chair, the scrape of wood against the floor, louder than the chatter in the room. She stood, her voice rising above the hush. "You are no longer my father. You don't deserve this family." The words hit me harder than any winter wind. For a moment, I did not breathe. My heart clenched as if the ground beneath me gave way. The room fell into silence. Forks stopped halfway to mouths. My sister Helen's eyes went wide. My son David froze with his glass still in his hand. I looked at Olivia, waiting for her to soften, to say she was angry or confused. But her face was stone cold and deliberate. Mark leaned back with a smirk, as if the scene pleased him. I forced a smile, though it felt like my lips were made of lead. Inside me, everything twisted. I thought of the little girl who once grabbed my hand at a county fair and said she never wanted to let go. Now that same daughter declared me erased. The whispers began. A cousin murmured something about how shocking it was. Another muttered that perhaps Olivia was only saying what others thought. My chest burned as the room seemed to close in. Samuel hesitated, his papers trembling slightly. He tried to continue reading, but Olivia cut him off, her voice sharp. "This is not his anymore. He doesn't get to decide." Mark added, "He has no business holding on to what he cannot handle. He should step aside." I heard a few hums of agreement, low but present. Others kept their heads down, unwilling to look at me. That silence was worse than the accusations. I sat there with my hands clasped on the table, knuckles white, and I thought of Margaret. I thought of how she trusted that her family would hold together when she was gone. My daughter's words sliced through that hope, through the image of the family Margaret wanted. I swallowed hard, nodded slightly, and said nothing. Sometimes silence is the only shield left. Inside, though, I felt something break. The room never returned to its earlier warmth. Laughter no longer rang through the house. Every word spoken after that carried an edge. And I knew in that moment, even before Samuel could finish, that this night would mark the beginning of a battle I had never wanted, but could no longer avoid. I sat back listening as others shifted uncomfortably and let my eyes fall to the floor where the light of the tree shimmered across the polished wood. Margaret's ornaments sparkled faintly in my peripheral vision. It should have been a night to honor her memory, but instead it had become the night my daughter severed me from the family in front of everyone. I did not stand. I did not argue. I only smiled and let the silence around me grow heavier, knowing deep down that this was only the start. Olivia's voice cut through the silence again, sharper now, as if she needed to drive the knife deeper. He is not capable of handling what Mom left behind. Look at him. He is old-tired, clinging to things he cannot manage. The words floated above the table like poison, and every eye turned back to me. Mark leaned forward, resting his elbow on the table, as though he were already in command. It is time to face the truth, Richard. You should step aside and let us handle it. He smiled faintly, not out of kindness, but victory. I held my breath, refusing to let the trembling in my chest show. My fork was still resting untouched on the plate before me, the food cold now. Across the table, my sister Helen shifted uncomfortably, her hands clasped tight in her lap. My son David lowered his gaze, his jaw clenched, as if he wanted to say something, but could not. The room buzzed with low murmurs. A cousin whispered something about practicality. Another muttered that Olivia had a point. That was worse than outright insults. Silence I could endure, but quiet agreement felt like betrayal multiplied. I looked at Olivia. Her face, once full of life when she was younger, now hardened into something unrecognizable. She carried herself like a judge passing sentence, no room for mercy. I wanted to ask her why. I wanted to remind her of nights when she fell asleep on my chest while Margaret hummed soft songs in the kitchen. I wanted to remind her that I once carried her on my shoulders at the county fair, her laughter brighter than the lights above the rides. But the words stayed locked in my throat. Mark pressed further. The accounts, the property, even the land outside Columbus, it all requires people who understand business, not nostalgia. He reached for Olivia's hand, squeezing it, as if sealing a deal in front of everyone. The chill that ran through me had nothing to do with the winter outside. It was the realization that this was not a sudden outburst. It was planned, calculated, delivered at the very moment the will was being read to humiliate me in front of the family. Samuel tried to intervene, clearing his throat. If we could just finish reading the will, we might avoid further misunderstanding. But Olivia raised her hand, cutting him off like she owned the room. There is nothing to misunderstand. He does not deserve to have control. The weight of her words pressed against my chest until I thought my ribs might break. Still, I forced my voice steady. If that is how you feel, Olivia, then you have already decided. She did not flinch. She looked at me as if I were no more than a stranger who had overstayed his welcome. Helen finally spoke, her voice trembling. Olivia, this is not the way. Your father deserves respect at the very least tonight. Olivia shot her a glance sharp enough to silence her. Respect is earned, Aunt Helen, not owed. The words sent a ripple through the table. Some shook their heads, others sat frozen. David lifted his eyes, then meeting mine across the distance. His face was pale, but his eyes burned with something unspoken, a mix of anger and sorrow. I wanted him to speak, to defend me, but he stayed silent. I could not blame him. He was caught between blood and fire, between a sister who carried influence and a father who was being stripped bare. Mark leaned back satisfied, as if Olivia's words had settled everything. I stared down at my hands, the veins standing out against the skin, and thought of Margaret again. She had trusted that her family would hold together when she was gone. Tonight her trust had been shattered by the very daughter she loved. The conversations around the table resumed, hesitant at first, then louder. But nothing returned to normal. Every word carried an edge, every glance a judgment. My presence had become a shadow no one wanted to acknowledge. I felt my chair scrape slightly as I shifted back. My chest was tight, my heart heavy, but I kept my face calm. This was no longer a celebration. It had become a trial, and I was the one being condemned. I caught Samuel's eyes across the table. He gave a small, almost imperceptible nod, as if to tell me to hold on, not to react. His expression carried something more than pity. There was weight in it, a secret waiting for the right moment. I pushed myself to stand, but not to argue. I would not give them that satisfaction. My voice would not shake here, not tonight. I excused myself quietly, barely heard over the murmur of voices, and walked toward the doorway. The air of the house felt stifling, thick with betrayal. I stepped into the hallway, the sound of laughter and clinking glasses fading behind me, replaced by the muffled thud of my own heartbeat. At that moment I realized something with painful clarity. Whatever this night had started, it was not going to end at this table. It was only the opening blow of a storm, still waiting outside those walls. The air hit me the second I stepped onto the porch, sharp and heavy with the smell of snow. My breath rose in clouds and disappeared into the December night, but the weight in my chest stayed. Behind me, the house was glowing with warm lights, shadows moving across the curtains, laughter bubbling up again as if nothing had happened. Their joy stung worse than the cold, because I knew it had been built on my silence, my humiliation. I pulled my coat tighter, though it did little to stop the wind that cut through the fabric. My boots crunched against the thin layer of ice on the steps as I walked down to the driveway. For a moment I just stood there, staring at the street lamps glowing faintly along the road. Snowflakes swirled in the yellow light like ash drifting down from some unseen fire. Inside my mind, Margaret's voice came back soft and steady, the way it always was. Do not let them forget who you are. Do not let our children believe they have no father. I closed my eyes and let those words anchor me even as my heart screamed that I had already lost Olivia. I wanted to go back inside to demand she explain herself, to ask her how she could throw me away in front of everyone. But I knew if I opened that door again, all I would find was more of the same. Their voices, their judgment, their certainty that I was finished. I shoved my hands into my coat pockets and started walking down the sidewalk, the sound of the party fading with each step. The snow muffled everything, even the cars that passed on the distant street, leaving me alone with my thoughts. I could not remember the last time I had felt so hollow, like every part of me had been scraped clean. For a long stretch, I let the memories come. Olivia as a little girl clutching my hand at the 4th of July parade, squealing at the fireworks. Her face when she got her first job, proud and eager to prove herself. All of it seemed so far away now, like someone else's life. Somewhere along the way, she had stopped seeing me as her father and started seeing me as an obstacle. The ache in my chest grew heavier with each step. I reached the corner of the block and stopped beneath a bare oak tree, its branches weighed down with ice. My breath came quick, not from the walk, but from the pressure inside me. It felt like grief and anger and shame had knotted together until I could not untangle them. I leaned against the trunk and whispered into the night. Margaret, I am trying. I swear I am trying. But I do not know how to fight this. The wind whipped harder, scattering snow across my face, stinging like needles. I stayed there until my hands ached from the cold, then pushed away from the tree. My steps were slower now, heavier, carrying me without direction. I did not know how long I wandered before I heard my phone buzz inside my pocket. The sound startled me, breaking through the blur of thoughts. I pulled it out, my fingers stiff, and saw Samuel's name glowing on the screen. For a moment I just stared, the light bright against the dark street. Then I pressed answer and lifted it to my ear. "Richard," his voice was low, almost urgent. "I need you to listen carefully." The weight in my chest shifted. I swallowed hard, my voice rough. "I am listening. There is something you did not see in the will." His words came slow, deliberate, as if each one carried more than he wanted to reveal over the phone. "We cannot talk about it tonight. Meet me tomorrow morning at my office, and do not mention this call to Olivia or Mark. Do you understand?" I felt my stomach drop. "What do you mean, something I did not see?" His reply was firm. "Tomorrow. Trust me." The line went dead before I could ask more. I stood there in the snow, the phone still pressed to my ear, the screen dark now. The night was quiet again, but inside my head, his words echoed. Something I did not see. I slid the phone back into my pocket, my hands trembling. The cold was biting harder, but it was not the cold that made me shiver. I lifted my eyes to the sky where the clouds hung heavy, hiding the stars. Somewhere inside me a spark flickered, small and uncertain, but alive. I turned back toward the direction of the house. Through the windows I could still see movement, hear faint bursts of laughter carried by the wind. My daughter was in there, celebrating her victory, believing she had erased me with a single declaration. I tightened my jaw, let out a long breath, and whispered to myself, "This is not over." The snow crunched beneath my boots as I started walking again, the weight in my chest shifting from despair into something sharper. I did not know yet what Samuel had meant, but I knew one thing with certainty. Whatever it was, it would change everything. The night felt colder on the walk back to my truck. Snow collected on the windshield in thin layers, blurring the reflection of the house behind me. I sat in the driver's seat, letting the engine hum while I stared at the faint glow from the living room windows. Olivia's voice carried faintly through the walls, even from where I sat, laughter mixed with sharp edges. I gripped the steering wheel tighter, my knuckles pale in the dim light. Samuel's words replayed again and again. Something I did not see. I wanted to know right then, but the way his voice had lowered, almost shaking, told me this was not something for a phone call. The weight of it settled deep in my gut. I leaned back, closing my eyes for a moment. Margaret's face filled my memory, her handwriting on the notes she used to leave for me in the kitchen, her steady voice when life got messy. I wondered if this hidden piece Samuel hinted at was her way of reaching me even now. The heater barely warmed the cab as I drove through the silent streets. Houses were lined with glowing Christmas lights, children's sleds abandoned in the snowbanks, reminders of a world that still had joy in it. My own heart felt like it was carrying stones. By the time I pulled into my driveway, the night had deepened, and the stillness wrapped around the small house like a heavy blanket. Inside, I did not turn on the lights right away. I sat at the kitchen table, staring at the dark window that reflected a tired, worn face back at me. I thought of Olivia's words at that table. "You are no longer my father." They echoed in the quiet, like they were carved into the walls. I pressed my palms flat against the wood, grounding myself, whispering under my breath that this was not finished. I must have sat there for hours, caught between anger and exhaustion, until the clock pushed past midnight. When I finally climbed into bed, sleep came in restless waves, broken by images of Margaret writing something under lamplight. Olivia tearing pages apart, Mark whispering into her ear. Morning came gray and heavy. The snow piled deeper outside. I shaved slowly, dressed in my best coat, though it was fraying at the edges, and drove to Samuel's office downtown. The city was quiet, streets still slick from the storm. Samuel's office sat in a brick building above a hardware store, the kind of place you only noticed if you knew to look for it. I climbed the narrow staircase, the creak of each step loud in the silence. When I knocked, Samuel opened the door quickly, as though he had been waiting at his desk the entire night. He gestured me in without a word. The blinds were drawn, only a desk lamp casting light across stacks of papers. His face looked more lined than it had the night before, his eyes tired, but alert. "Richard," he said softly once the door was closed. "I did not want to say anything yesterday in front of them, not with the tension in that room, but there is a document written by Margaret in 2018 that changes the meaning of everything that was read last night." I stood there, my hands tightening around the back of the chair before I sat. My voice felt heavy. "What kind of document?" He opened a locked drawer and pulled out a file, sliding it across the desk toward me. His fingers lingered on the edges before he let go. "It is a handwritten addendum to her will. Margaret signed it herself. I have verified it against her previous handwriting." I opened the folder, my eyes scanning the familiar cursive. My breath caught when I saw her name signed at the bottom. The words above it shook me more than her signature. She had written that I, Richard Hale, was to have the final decision on the family home and land regardless of any dispute. She had written that her wish was for me to remain in that house until my last days if I chose. My throat tightened. She had left me not just a house, but dignity, authority, a recognition that I was not to be erased. I whispered her name like a prayer, "Margaret," and blinked against the sting in my eyes. Samuel leaned forward, his voice low. "I believe Olivia knew about this. I sent copies to her months ago, but she never acknowledged them. Last night, she made no mention of it. That silence tells me she chose to bury this." The words pressed on me with the weight of betrayal. My own daughter, who once clung to me with trust, now willing to hide her mother's wishes to strip me of mine. I sat back in the chair, the paper trembling in my hands. Why would she do this? Samuel sighed. Ambition, influence from Mark. Perhaps resentment? I cannot say for sure, but I can tell you this. If you decide to challenge her, this document gives you the standing you need. For a long moment I said nothing. Only listened to the tick of the clock on the wall. The hum of the heater pushing against the winter chill. Then I folded the document carefully and slid it back across the desk. Keep it safe, Samuel. We are going to need it. His eyes met mine, steady and firm. Are you ready for what this means? I thought of Olivia's face, of Mark's smug smile, of the whispers around that table. I thought of Margaret, of the way her handwriting curved with patience, not anger. My voice was quiet, but certain. Yes. The office fell into silence again, heavy but different this time. It was not the silence of defeat, but of something beginning to turn. I left Samuel's office with the snow crunching under my boots, the addendum still burning in my mind. The streets felt different, sharper, as though the city itself knew something had shifted. The storm had not passed. It was only gathering. I drove home from Samuel's office with the paper still burned into my thoughts. But the memories that surfaced were older than any ink. Olivia's voice as a little girl came back to me in waves, calling me her hero, when I fixed her bike, clapping her hands, when I lifted her onto my shoulders at the county fair. Those moments had felt like forever once, and now they felt like they belonged to someone else's life. Back then she looked at me like I was unshakable, like nothing could topple me. Somewhere along the line, that look changed. It started after I left the factory and settled into retirement. She used to ask me about my work when she was in law school, her eyes wide when I told her about the machines and the hours I put in. But the older she grew, the more she compared me to others. She talked about friends who were moving up in firms, cousins who had investments, people who carried titles. She stopped seeing the work I had done as enough. Then Mark entered her life. From the start, he carried himself with the confidence of a man who thought the world owed him a place at the table. I remember the first Thanksgiving he joined us, sitting beside Olivia as though he already belonged. He spoke about deals and properties, shaking hands too firmly, with every cousin smiling too easily. Margaret told me later that night she did not trust the way he looked at Olivia, like she was another acquisition. The years with Mark hardened her. Where she once asked me for advice, she began quoting him instead. He told her she needed to cut loose the dead weight, that she was capable of so much more without people holding her back. I did not realize until too late that I was the dead weight he meant. One evening, about a year before Margaret passed, Olivia had invited us to a small gathering at their townhouse. She introduced me to her colleagues, but when one of them asked what I did, she smiled tightly and said only that I was retired. She never mentioned the decades of work, the years I gave to provide for her. I stood there with a glass in my hand, invisible in a room filled with people who knew her only as Mark's wife and a rising attorney. That night, when I asked her quietly why she had not told them about my work, she looked away and said it was not important. Those words stayed with me longer than I ever admitted. After Margaret's death, it grew worse. Olivia became sharper, more ambitious, and Mark's voice in her ear was louder than mine had ever been. Every decision I made, every piece of advice I offered, she waved away. I watched her turn into someone I barely recognized, and I wondered if grief had twisted her, or if this was who she had been becoming all along. I thought of all this as I sat in my kitchen, now the light of morning pushing through the thin curtains. The document Samuel had shown me gave me legal ground, but it did not soften the ache of losing my daughter's trust. Helen stopped by that afternoon. She stood in the doorway brushing snow off her coat, her face pale with concern. I poured her coffee, and we sat at the table. She reached across, covering my hand with hers. I heard what she said last night, Richard. It broke my heart. I nodded, the words too heavy to form. Helen's eyes watered. Margaret would never have wanted this. She would not have believed her own daughter could act this way. I swallowed hard and looked down at the table. She would not have believed it, but she knew Olivia was stubborn. She worried Mark would turn her against me. Helen squeezed my hand. Then you cannot let him win. Not after everything you gave for this family. I looked up, meeting her gaze. I am not sure I can bring her back to me. She shook her head firmly. You do not have to bring her back. You have to protect what Margaret left behind for yourself and for David. The mention of my son pulled at me. David had been so quiet at the table last night, his eyes full of something I could not name. He was younger, more reserved, not as loud as Olivia, but his silence carried weight. Helen leaned closer. You still have people on your side, Richard. Do not forget that. Her words settled over me like a blanket, not warm exactly, but grounding. I nodded slowly, gripping my cup as if it might steady me. After she left, the house was silent again. I sat in the kitchen thinking of Olivia, of the way she had looked at me with nothing but coldness. I wondered when exactly she stopped seeing me as her father and started seeing me as someone to defeat. Outside, the snow kept falling, covering the streets in white, burying everything beneath it. I stared out the window at the stillness and thought of Samuel's words, of Margaret's handwriting on that page, of Helen's steady voice, reminding me I was not alone. The storm inside me had not settled. If anything, it was rising, and I knew sooner or later I would have to walk back into that house and face the daughter who no longer called me her father. The following morning, the air felt sharp enough to cut skin as I stepped out of the house. The city streets of Columbus were blanketed in a fresh layer of snow, the kind that muffled every sound and made you feel like you were walking through another world. I drove slowly downtown, my hand steady on the wheel, though my mind churned. Samuel's office waited, and with it the paper that might be the only weapon I had left. When I arrived, he was already at his desk. He motioned for me to sit, his eyes studying me carefully, like he was weighing whether I was ready for what came next. Without a word, he slid the folder toward me again. The addendum glowed under the lamp, Margaret's handwriting, steady and unmistakable. I read the words for a second time, letting them carve into me. She had given me the authority, not Olivia, not Mark. It was her way of making sure my voice would not be silenced. I looked up at Samuel, my throat thick. What happens now? He leaned back, fingers laced together. If you want to challenge them, we file with the court. But before we do that, you need to know the cost. It will not be quiet. Families divide over things like this. You could lose Olivia completely. A bitter laugh escaped me. I think I already have. His expression softened, but he did not argue. Instead, he tapped the document. This is solid, Richard. I have verified the signature. The witnesses who were present back in 2018 are still alive. If Olivia tries to fight this, the law is on your side. I nodded, the decision forming inside me, like a stone sinking into place. I will not let her bury Margaret's wishes. Samuel gave a short nod. Then we begin. The weight of it followed me out of his office. The streets were busier now, traffic moving slow on the salted roads. I parked outside a diner on the corner, the kind of place Margaret used to love for its pie. I slid into a booth and ordered coffee, staring at the steam curling from the cup, while I let everything settle. Around me, people chatted about last-minute shopping. Kids pressed their noses to the window to watch the snow fall, and I sat there with the knowledge that my family was splintering. When I got home, I pulled out the box of Margaret's things I had kept in the closet. Old photographs, letters, the watch she gave me on our 25th anniversary. I held one of her letters, the ink faded, but her words still steady. Keep standing, Richard. Do not let the storms decide who you are. I read it twice, then tucked it back carefully. That evening, as the sun dropped and the cold pressed harder against the windows, Helen came by again. She carried a casserole dish wrapped in foil, setting it on the counter with a sigh. I thought you could use something warm. I poured her tea and we sat at the kitchen table. She looked at me closely, her voice low. Did Samuel show you? I nodded. He did. And it is real. Margaret made sure of it. Helen's shoulders eased, relief flooding her face. I told you she would never leave you without protection. I leaned back, rubbing a hand over my jaw. Olivia knew Helen. Samuel sent her copies months ago. She chose to hide it. The words hung heavy between us. Helen shook her head slowly, grief settling in her eyes. I never thought she would sink so low. Neither did I admitted. But here we are. Helen reached for my hand again. Then you fight. Not just for you, but for Margaret and for David. I thought of my son, the quiet strength in his eyes, the way he had looked at me across the table that night. Maybe he was waiting to see if I would stand or collapse. The next day, Samuel filed the paperwork. The addendum was now in the court's hands, stamped and sealed. The process had officially begun. Word spread quickly through the family. Cousins called with hushed voices, some offering support, others warning me that Olivia was furious. By the third day, my phone rang late in the evening. I picked it up, and Samuel's voice came steady but urgent. She is moving fast, Richard. She has hired her own attorney and plans to dispute the validity. But I expected that. Do not let it rattle you. I thanked him and hung up, but my hand trembled slightly as I set the phone down. I stared out the window at the street lamps glowing against the snow, and knew the storm I had feared was no longer approaching. It was here. I stayed by the window a long time that night, the addendum safe in Samuel's care, Margaret's words safe in my heart. Olivia could deny me, she could humiliate me, but she could not erase the truth her mother had written. The snow kept falling, each flake disappearing into the white, and I stood there whispering into the glass, promising Margaret and myself that I would not back down. The invitation came in the form of a coldly written message from Olivia. She wanted the family to gather again at the house, not for Christmas this time, but for what she called clarification. I read it twice, the words clipped and businesslike, nothing of a daughter speaking to her father. My gut told me it would not be a gathering for peace, but another battlefield. When I walked into the house that evening, the warmth of the lights did nothing to ease the chill in my chest. Relatives were already there, scattered in the living room and dining room, their voices low. Some glanced at me with pity, others with curiosity, as if waiting to see if I would crumble or fight. Olivia stood near the fireplace, her arms crossed, Mark beside her, with that same smug look that had become his signature. She didn't greet me. Instead, as soon as I stepped further into the room, she raised her chin and spoke loud enough for everyone to hear. "Father insists he has rights that do not belong to him. It is time to put an end to this." I felt every eye turn to me. My jaw tightened, but my voice came steady. Margaret left her wishes in writing. Samuel has the document. You know this, Olivia. Her face hardened. That paper means nothing. It is forged or irrelevant. What matters is what was read on Christmas. Mark cut in his tone, dripping with disdain. He's trying to cling to something that is gone. It is pathetic. The words burned, but I didn't let them show. I took a step forward, closer to where Olivia stood. Your mother wanted me to have the final say on this house. She trusted me. She wanted me here. Olivia's eyes flashed. You think she trusted you? You were never enough for her. Not for me, not for anyone. The blow landed deeper than I wanted to admit. I opened my mouth to respond, but a voice from the side stopped me. It was David. He had been sitting quietly on the arm of a chair, his face tense, his hands clenched. That's not true, Olivia. Mom loved him. She trusted him more than anyone. The room shifted. Whispers started again, some surprised, others leaning in. Olivia turned toward her brother, her expression incredulous. You are siding with him. David stood now, his voice firmer. I am siding with the truth. For a moment, the silence was louder than anything. My heart swelled with both pain and pride. My son had spoken not with anger, but with conviction. Olivia's face darkened. She looked around the room as if searching for allies, and a few cousins nodded hesitantly. But the crack in her certainty had already formed. I let the silence stretch before I spoke again, my voice calm. I don't want a war, Olivia. I want respect for what your mother wrote, for what she wanted. Mark scoffed. Respect. You should be grateful we have not already thrown you out. That was enough. I stepped closer, my eyes locked on his. You do not speak for this family, and you do not erase me. The tension snapped like a wire pulled too tight. Helen, my sister, stood and raised her voice, something she rarely did. I was there when Margaret wrote that addendum. I saw her pen her name with my own eyes. Gasps filled the room. Olivia whipped her head toward Helen, disbelief painted across her face. You are lying. Helen did not flinch. I would never lie about my sister. She wanted Richard to have that house. She told me herself. The room erupted into murmurs, louder now, less certain of Olivia's authority. Olivia's voice shook as she tried to regain control. None of this matters. The court will decide. I looked at her, then really looked, and saw a woman who was once my little girl, now trapped in ambition and bitterness. My heart ached, but I knew pity would not serve here. I turned to the relatives gathered, raising my voice just enough. You have heard the truth tonight? Margaret's wishes were clear. Whether Olivia accepts them or not, the truth will stand. The room settled into silence again, heavy and thick. Olivia's eyes narrowed and she turned abruptly, storming out of the room with Mark at her heels. The sound of the front door slamming echoed through the hall. I stood still, my breath heavy, my heart pounding. David came to my side, placing a hand on my shoulder. For the first time since this nightmare began, I felt something shift. Not victory, not yet, but a spark of hope that I was not standing alone. The whispers continued around me, cousins arguing in hushed tones, Helen steady at my side. I could feel the battle lines being drawn more clearly than ever, and I knew this was not the end. It was only the beginning of a fight that would test every piece of me. The legal papers arrived on a Friday morning, tucked in a crisp envelope with Olivia's attorney's name stamped across the corner. I stood at the mailbox for a long while, the cold biting at my fingers as I held the envelope, my breath fogging in the winter air. By the time I opened it, at the kitchen table, I already knew what it would say. Olivia was contesting the addendum, claiming it was invalid, and accusing me of fabricating her mother's wishes. I read the words slowly, letting them slice into me, each line colder than the last. She had reduced me to an opponent, stripping away the word father and replacing it with petitioner. It was no longer family in her eyes. It was a case to win. I called Samuel immediately. He answered on the first ring, his voice steady as always. I have been expecting this, Richard. Do not panic. We have the document, we have witnesses. This will not be easy, but it is winnable. Easy, I muttered, staring at the letter. She is accusing me of forging her mother's handwriting. Samuel's voice dropped lower, firm. Let her accuse. We will show the truth. The next days blurred with preparation. Samuel met me at his office with stacks of files, the hum of the old radiator filling the silence as he laid out our strategy. He would bring in handwriting experts to verify Margaret's signature, and he would call Helen as a witness. Helen had been there when Margaret wrote the addendum, and her testimony could not be ignored. I nodded along, but my chest was heavy. Every piece of this fight meant dragging Margaret's memory into the courtroom, exposing her words to strangers in suits who never knew her smile. At night, the weight followed me. I lay awake listening to the creak of the house, the wind pressing against the windows, remembering the warmth of Margaret's hand in mine, the quiet confidence she gave me. I whispered her name into the dark, promising her I would not let her be erased. The following week, Helen came by with a determined look. She sat across from me at the table, her hands clasped tight. I want to testify, Richard. I was there. I saw her write it. Her voice was strong, but her eyes carried grief. I reached across the table and covered her hand with mine. Are you sure, Helen? They will try to tear you apart on that stand. She nodded. I am sure. Margaret would do the same for us. The lump in my throat made it hard to answer, but I squeezed her hand and whispered, Thank you. A few days later, word came that Olivia was assembling her own witnesses. People from her firm relatives who had leaned her way, even distant cousins who barely knew Margaret, but had been promised influence. Mark's voice was all over it, convincing them that siding with Olivia was siding with progress, with power. I tried not to let the anger consume me, but it gnawed at me in quiet moments. My own daughter was painting me as a liar, a manipulator, a man trying to steal what never belonged to him. One evening, as I sat staring at the fire, David walked in. He had been quiet since the gathering, watching from the edges. He pulled a chair beside me, his face serious. I want to help, Dad. I looked at him, my chest tightening. Help how? He hesitated, then said, I still have the messages Mom sent me before she passed. She mentioned wanting you to stay in the house. She said she trusted you to take care of it. The words hit me like a tide. You still have them? He nodded. I kept them. I thought they might matter someday. For the first time in weeks, a crack of light pierced the storm. If those messages were admitted, they would show Margaret's intent beyond any paper Olivia tried to bury. I put a hand on his shoulder, my voice thick. "You do not know what this means, son." David's eyes softened. "I do. I was quiet too long. I won't be now." The days leading up to the first hearing were a blur of phone calls and meetings. Samuel kept his tone calm, but I could see the weight on his face. He knew Olivia would throw everything at us, and that the courtroom was a place where truth often fought uphill battles. The morning of the hearing, I stood outside the courthouse with the document in my coat pocket, Helen on one side, David on the other. Snow was falling again, soft but relentless, blanketing the city in white. I looked up at the heavy doors and felt the ache in my chest steady into resolve. Inside, the air smelled of polish and old paper, the sound of footsteps echoing on marble floors. I sat at the long wooden table beside Samuel, across from Olivia and Mark. She would not meet my eyes. Her jaw was set, her posture rigid, her hands clutching her notes like weapons. When the judge entered and the room rose, I felt Margaret's presence as if she were standing behind me. I heard her voice in my mind, calm and steady, telling me to keep standing. The gavel struck the room hushed, and the battle I had dreaded for weeks began. Samuel's voice carried steady across the courtroom as he laid the foundation, introducing the addendum and Margaret's handwriting. He spoke with the calm assurance of a man who had built cases brick by brick his whole career. I sat beside him, my hands clenched on the table, my eyes fixed on the document as it was passed up to the judge. For a moment the world shrank to those pages, the familiar loops of Margaret's signature, her careful phrasing that still sounded like her voice in my head. Across from us, Olivia's attorney rose with a practiced smile and began dismantling everything. He claimed the paper was suspicious, questioned why it had not been presented at the original reading, implied Samuel had produced it only when convenient. Every word felt like an attempt to scrub away Margaret's intent, and I gritted my teeth until my jaw ached. Then they called Olivia to the stand. My daughter walked with perfect poise, her crimson jacket crisp, her hair pinned tightly back. She did not look at me. She swore her oath and sat her voice smooth as she told the court that she had never seen such a document before and believed it to be false. She said Margaret had always told her the estate was to be divided fairly, not controlled by one person. Her words fell like stones, heavy and deliberate, meant to bury me beneath them. When Samuel began his cross-examination, Olivia's mask cracked just slightly. He asked why she had ignored his letters months ago when he sent her copies of the addendum. She stumbled, saying she never received them. Samuel pressed further, producing the certified mail receipts. The courtroom shifted with murmurs, and Olivia's face flushed, though she quickly regained control. The judge's gavel quieted the room, but I caught the flicker in Olivia's eyes. For the first time since this started, she had been forced to step off her carefully built stage. Next, Samuel called Helen. My sister walked with quiet strength, her hands folded, her voice trembling only at the beginning. She told the court she had been there in 2018, that she sat with Margaret at the kitchen table as she wrote the addendum. She remembered Margaret's exact words, that she wanted Richard to remain in the house because he had given his life to it, because she trusted him to preserve the family home. Olivia's attorney tried to shake her. He asked if her memory might be faulty, if grief had blurred her recollection. Helen straightened her eyes sharp as she said, "I know what I saw. I know what my sister wanted. No one could move her from that." The tide shifted again, and I felt my throat burn with gratitude. Then came a surprise no one expected. The courtroom doors opened, and Eleanor Blake, my cousin from out of town, stepped inside carrying a worn envelope. She asked to speak, and after a brief pause, the judge allowed it. She explained that Margaret had sent her a copy of the addendum years ago, asking her to keep it safe. She unfolded the paper with shaking hands, and there it was. Margaret's handwriting once more, her signature steady, her wishes undeniable. Olivia's attorney stammered, objected, claimed it was theatrical. But the judge allowed it into evidence, his brow furrowed as he studied the matching words. I looked at Olivia then. Her face had drained of color, her hands gripping the edge of the table. Mark leaned toward her, whispering furiously, but her eyes darted across the room, unsettled for the first time. When court adjourned for the day, I walked slowly out into the marble hallway. My knees felt weak, my chest heavy, but there was air in my lungs again. David appeared at my side, placing a steady hand on my arm. "Dad, we are winning." I shook my head. "It is not about winning, son. It is about truth." Still, his smile carried something I had not seen in weeks. Hope. As we stepped outside, the cold air wrapped around us, but it no longer felt suffocating. Snow still fell soft and endless, but for the first time, it felt less like a storm and more like a cleansing. I glanced back at the courthouse doors, knowing Olivia would walk through them soon, knowing her anger would be sharper than ever. This battle was far from over, but a shift had begun, and I could feel it deep in my bones. That night I sat alone in the living room, the fireplace dimming to embers, the house filled with a silence so heavy it pressed against my chest. Margaret's picture sat on the mantel, her eyes soft as if reminding me why I was still fighting. My body was tired, but my mind would not rest. Every detail from the courtroom replayed in my head, every word from Olivia, cutting deeper than I wanted to admit. The phone buzzed on the table, startling me. I picked it up and saw David's name. He spoke quickly, his voice low. "Dad, I think Olivia's planning something outside of court. I overheard Mark talking to her after the hearing. He mentioned moving funds, something about accounts Mom set up." I straightened, gripping the phone tighter. "What accounts?" David hesitated. "College savings, maybe. But he said she was using them to prove you mishandled money." My pulse thudded in my ears. Those accounts had been untouched, meant for the grandchildren. I had never touched a dime. If Olivia was planning to twist that, it meant dragging every bit of our family's finances through the mud. "Thank you, son," I said quietly. "Keep everything you have. We may need it." After the call, I sat staring into the dying fire, my fists clenched. She was not just trying to take the house now. She wanted to stain my name, to paint me as a thief in front of everyone who ever respected me. The next morning, I went to Samuel's office, the sky outside gray with snow clouds. He listened carefully as I explained what David had heard. His brow furrowed, his hand tapping the desk. "If she tries to introduce that, we will demand the full account records. We will show nothing was touched. But Richard, this means she is desperate. Desperate people make mistakes, but they can also strike hard." I nodded, though a knot stayed in my stomach. Desperate was exactly what Olivia had become, and desperation mixed with pride was dangerous. Later that week, I stopped by Helen's house. She poured coffee into mismatched mugs, her kitchen smelling faintly of cinnamon. She studied me across the table. "She is trying to destroy you, Richard." I let out a tired laugh. "She already has in so many ways." Helen shook her head. "No. You are still standing. That is what she hates." Her words stayed with me as I walked home through the snow, each crunch of my boots in the frozen ground echoing in the still night. The second hearing came faster than I expected. Olivia arrived with new papers, her lawyer waving them like a flag. He claimed financial impropriety, pointing to the children's college funds. Samuel rose calm as ever, demanding full disclosure and bank records. The judge agreed, setting a new date for review. Olivia's eyes burned into me as we left the courtroom, her voice sharp as she hissed, "You are going to regret fighting me." For a moment, the sting of her words cut deep, not because of the threat, but because she had once run into my arms after nightmares calling me her hero. I searched her face for a trace of that little girl, but all I found was cold determination. Outside, David was waiting, his jaw set. "Let her threaten, Dad. We have truth." I placed a hand on his shoulder, grateful for his presence. He was no longer the boy who asked for my help with homework. He was a man standing beside me in battle, and I could not have asked for more. That evening, as the snow thickened, I sat again by the fire. My mind wandered back to Margaret's last days, her voice soft but clear when she told me not to give up on our children, no matter how far they strayed. I whispered into the empty room, "I hear you, Margaret. I will not stop." The storm outside rattled the windows, a reminder that the fight was not over. And as I watched the flames flicker, I knew Olivia would not back down either. The hardest part was still ahead, waiting like ice beneath thin ground, ready to crack at the next step. The morning of the final hearing broke cold and sharp, the kind of winter air that cut through coats and gloves, as if determined to remind you who was in control. I stood outside the courthouse steps, watching my breath hang like smoke, my hands gripping the railing tighter than I realized. Samuel arrived with his usual calm, carrying his worn leather briefcase. He gave me a nod, steady and reassuring, but his eyes told me he knew what was at stake. Inside the courtroom hummed with a tension that settled into my bones. Olivia sat across from me in a dark navy suit, her posture rigid, her lips pressed tight. Mark hovered close, whispering in her ear, his eyes darting around the room like a man waiting for a fight to break out. The judge entered, the gavel struck, and silence fell heavy over us all. Samuel began by presenting the bank records. He walked the court through every line, showing clearly that the college funds remained untouched, preserved exactly as Margaret had intended. His voice carried no dramatics, just quiet certainty. I watched the judge lean forward, studying the papers, nodding slightly as he followed Samuel's explanation. Then Olivia's lawyer rose sharp and confident. He argued that intent was still unclear, that Margaret had been frail, that undue influence could have been at play. Each word dug at me, painting me as a man who had manipulated his wife in her final years. My stomach tightened, but I forced myself to look up to meet his accusations with silence rather than anger. When it was Olivia's turn to speak again, she took the stand with a determined expression. Her voice was measured, her words carefully chosen. She said she believed Margaret never wanted one person to hold power over the estate. She said she loved her mother deeply and wanted to honor her true wishes. For a moment, I almost believed the sincerity in her tone. But then she turned her gaze on me, her eyes cold, and added that her father had grown bitter, that grief had clouded his judgment, and that this entire fight was about his pride, not Margaret's will. The words pierced me, but I kept my jaw set. If I let her see me break, it would be her victory. Samuel rose for cross-examination. His questions came firm and precise. He asked Olivia why, if she believed so strongly in fairness, she had never mentioned the addendum Margaret discussed with Helen. He presented the copy Eleanor had kept, and the room shifted. Olivia faltered just for a second, her voice catching as she tried to explain it away. But the damage was done. The truth was in black and white in Margaret's own hand, and no amount of denial could erase it. David was called next. He carried himself with a quiet strength I had not seen before. He spoke of the messages Margaret had sent him, of her trust in me, of her words, that the house should remain a place of family, not division. His voice cracked once, but he did not waver. I felt my throat tighten as I listened, pride and sorrow twisting together inside me. When court adjourned for lunch, I stepped outside into the brittle air. Helen joined me, pulling her coat tighter around her shoulders. She said softly, "She is still your daughter, Richard." I nodded, staring out at the snow drifting across the courthouse steps. I know. That is what makes it hurt so much. The afternoon session began with closing arguments. Olivia's lawyer painted her as the dutiful child, fighting to protect her mother's legacy from a grieving man blinded by loss. Samuel countered with facts, with signatures, with testimonies that aligned without flaw. He spoke of Margaret's clarity, her deliberate choice to ensure the home stayed with me. His final words were steady. "This is not about pride. It is about honoring a woman's clear written wish." As he sat down, silence lingered in the room. The judge leaned back, his eyes scanning the papers before him, his expression unreadable. My pulse thundered in my ears as he spoke of the weight of evidence, the clarity of the handwriting experts, the consistency of witness testimony. I could feel Olivia staring at me, her gaze burning with anger and fear. I wanted to turn to meet her eyes, to tell her that none of this was meant to be war between us. But I stayed still, waiting, knowing the next words would decide everything. The judge cleared his throat, his voice calm, yet heavy. "The court finds the addendum valid and enforceable. The residence shall remain with Richard Hayes in accordance with Margaret Hayes's written wishes." Gasps rippled through the room. I felt my knees weaken, my hand gripping the table to steady myself. Margaret's voice echoed in my heart, as if she were standing there, whispering that I had not failed her. Across the aisle, Olivia's face twisted with disbelief, her lawyer whispering urgently to her, but she would not look at me. Mark tugged at her arm, but she pulled away, her jaw trembling as she gathered her papers with shaking hands. I sat frozen in place, the words still sinking in the storm inside me, colliding with relief so sharp it nearly broke me open. The gavel struck one final time, and the courtroom began to empty, footsteps echoing on the marble floor. I stayed seated, unable to move my breath, shallow, my hands trembling. The fight was over on paper, but I knew the wound between me and Olivia had only deepened. As the room cleared, I finally rose, my eyes finding Margaret's picture in my mind, steadying me with the memory of her smile. I whispered under my breath, "It is done, Margaret. We made it through." But as I walked toward the heavy doors, the echo of Olivia's voice followed me sharp and cold. A reminder that winning in court was not the same as healing what had been broken at home. When I stepped out into the cold, the air struck me harder than I expected, sharp against my face, carrying with it the weight of everything that had just ended. Snow was falling again, soft flakes drifting through the gray sky, landing on my coat and melting instantly. I paused on the courthouse steps, staring down at the crowd, dispersing lawyers rushing off to their cars, families whispering in clusters. David stood a few feet away, his shoulders squared, his eyes searching for mine. When I met his gaze, he gave me a small nod, a quiet confirmation that it was over. Helen joined us, pulling her scarf tight around her neck. She looked tired, her cheeks flushed from the courtroom heat. She whispered, "Margaret would be proud of you." The words almost broke me. I swallowed hard, nodded, and kept walking down the steps, each one feeling heavier than the last. Olivia did not follow. She had stormed out a different door, Mark close at her side. I imagined the fire in her eyes, the fury she carried now that she had lost. But beneath all that anger, I hoped a piece of her still remembered the years when I tucked her in at night, when she used to rest her head on my chest and call me her safe place. That hope, faint as it was, kept me moving. Back at the house, the quiet wrapped around me. The same walls that had once echoed with Margaret's laughter. The same floors where Olivia had taken her first steps, the same staircase David and his friends had thundered down in their teenage years. It was all still here. But it felt different now, heavier, as if every corner carried the echo of the fight we had just survived. David helped me stack the files Samuel had left behind. When we were done, he sat at the table, his hands clasped, his eyes steady on me. "You won, Dad. But you look like you lost." I exhaled slowly, rubbing my temples. I did not lose the house, but I lost something else. He nodded as if he had already known what I meant. After a long silence, he said, "Maybe she will come around. Maybe not now, but someday. I wanted to believe that. I wanted to believe that the daughter who had turned her back on me in a courtroom could someday find her way back home. For now, though, all I could do was stand in the house Margaret had trusted me to keep and live the kind of life she wanted for us. That night I sat by the fire again, the flames dancing shadows across the room. I pulled out a small box Margaret had kept tucked away, filled with photos and letters. One picture caught me off guard. Olivia, at 7 years old, standing by the Christmas tree, her eyes bright, her hands clutching a doll she had begged for. I remembered the way she had run to me that morning, squealing with joy, wrapping her arms around my neck. I pressed the photo to my chest, whispering into the crackle of the fire, "I am still your father. That will never change." The weeks that followed were quiet, but not empty. Neighbors stopped by with warm casseroles, friends called to check in, and Helen visited often. David came every Sunday sometimes with his kids, filling the house with noise again. Their laughter was a balm, their little feet pounding the same floors their father once had. It reminded me why I had fought so hard. Not for pride, not for power, but for the soul of this home, for the chance to pass on more than just walls and bricks. One evening, months later, I heard a car pull into the driveway. When I looked out the window, my heart caught. Olivia sat behind the wheel, her face pale in the glow of the headlights. She did not get out. She sat there for a long while, staring at the house. I stood at the window, frozen, not daring to move. After several minutes, she finally backed out and drove away, leaving tire tracks in the snow. My chest ached, but there was a flicker of hope. She had come even if only to look. I did not chase her. I simply whispered to the empty room, "I will be here when you are ready." Life has a way of testing every piece of us. It strips us down, pushes us to the edge, makes us question who we are and what we are worth. But sometimes through the storms and the battles, we discover strength we did not know we had. I had discovered mine not in victory, but in the decision to keep standing, to keep showing up even when the ones you love push you away. Margaret's house still stood. My son and grandchildren still filled it with love. And though my daughter's voice still haunted me, I carried hope that one day it would soften, that one day she would walk back through these doors. Until then, I would honor Margaret's wishes, and I would keep the promise I made to myself on that snowy night. I would not abandon my family, not again, not ever. Thank you for staying with me through this story. If it touched you, if it made you think of your own family, I invite you to share your thoughts in the comments. Tell me what moments stayed with you, and if you have ever faced battles that tested your heart. And if you want to hear more stories like this, make sure to subscribe and stay with us. There are always more stories to tell, and together we can keep listening, learning, and remembering that even in the hardest winters, there is always a reason to keep standing.